You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, and even a little bit of news and gossip with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today, we're talking to film historian and actor Steve Stoliar. And now, here's Steve.
Hi, Steve. It's good to hear your voice again, and also to see you, at least on my phone.
Likewise.
And, you know, you're such a comedy person. You've written comedy. You've preserved comedy. You spent a great deal of time with perhaps one of the greatest comedians of all time, Mr. Groucho Marx. I have to start off the conversation by asking you the state of comedy in America today, because, as you know, my writing partner, Billy Reback, and I are always trying to get comedies out there. But we find that comedy has changed. How do you see the world of comedy today?
Well, I do hate, loathe, and despise political correctness. And so I think I'm with Seinfeld in terms of how difficult it is to get away with a lot of things that would not have been troublesome in earlier years now result in the sharp intake of breath because you have hit one of the invisible electrical barriers to expressing yourself. And so I think it's a lot more restrictive. I'm not saying that everyone needs to work blue, as they used to say, but there's so many things now. I mean, you think about how much ethnic humor there was in all the classic films and radio shows and TV shows. People don't even seem to have a tolerance for observing blackface in the context of the times. They're just so reflexively ready to say, this must not be viewed or our eyes will explode. It must be. Yes, sir, we have a question in the back.
Yes, Steve, I do have a question. Somewhere along yesterday, something jumped up on my YouTube, and it was Don Rickles doing the opening from a Saturday Night Live, my guess is late 70s, maybe early 80s. And it was hysterical, but it was everything. He just rolled it all out at once. How does he do today? Does that work today? Could he even do it?
I don't think he could today. I think he got, it's because he got a running start on being defined with that style of comedy that people let him get away with it. But nobody starting out now would ever study his material and then go to a club and try it out that night to see what happens, or find a black guy and pretend you've been stuck in the neck with a spear and look at an Irishman and wonder why he's still sober after 3 minutes in the bar, and a Jewish guy looking, where's my wallet? And you couldn't, he would just, someone starting out like that would just be shut down immediately, canceled.
I agree, but in this piece, Steve, in this piece on Saturday Night Live, he did everything. He had Swiss, Puerto Ricans, you name it, Italians, Irish, yes. He did it all, and it was hysterical. But I guess you're right. I don't know that he can do it today. Well, could.
And it was as if at the end of his massacre, he would say, I kid because I love.
That's right.
And it's all about love, and I love everyone. And that's supposed to negate any hurt feelings about teasing a fat man or an old woman or whatever ethnicity you plug into the equation. No, I don't. It's tough enough with Groucho. I find myself having to defend him. I mean, if I choose, I could just ignore people that question, don't people realize how he would hurt feelings by insulting them? And this whole thing about the alleged Groucho T.S. Eliot feud it's been filtered through the prism of taking things literally, which you should not do with Groucho. And people would look at like one of his letters to Eliot where he would, poke fun at him, and people would say, maybe it was Eliot's anti-Semitism that caused Groucho to lash out like that. And it's like people, they admired each other enormously. Each was flattered that the other answered his letters, and they loved the few times they were able to get together. But now, just in the cold light of not hearing the delivery and not understanding the context, people look at the words they exchange and think, wow, this is pretty rough stuff. And you bet your life Groucho would look at women in tight sweaters and make comments about them and wiggle his eyebrows. And with today's tastes, that would be considered offensive and sexist and all those other things. And it's really hard to once someone has been indoctrinated like that, it's hard for me to convince them to try to view it as a TV viewer in the 50s or a moviegoer in the 30s.
I wanted to ask you, Steve, you're a college student and you love Animal Crackers, a Groucho film that Universal ends up owning through Paramount in one of the dopiest deals ever made. But let's talk in terms of what you do with Animal Crackers, and does that lead you to Groucho?
Yes. Okay.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer.
That was very succinct.
People give roundabout answers to so many things. I thought I would just pretend that I'm giving a deposition where it's just yes, no, I don't recall.
You did beautifully.
Thank you. Oh gosh, how do I encapsulate this? Animal Crackers, when I was growing up, Animal Crackers was the great lost Marx Brothers film. They only made 12 or 13, but that was the one that got away. And my friends and I weren't sure why that was, but it was not included with the Paramount package that would cycle through on television, where they would have that triangular shield that says MCA TV release, and I would want to rush over with a Marx-a-lot and turn A into an, because MCA. And I later learned that it was because the rights to the film had expired while it was under Paramount's aegis, and had reverted back to the authors and composers of the play, George Kaufman, Maury Riskin, Harry Ruby, Bert Kalmar. And it was essentially a clerical error that it wasn't renewed, but nobody at Paramount felt like it was worth untangling the legal morass. And then when the old Paramount films were sold to MCA in the late 50s, Animal Crackers was among them, but they didn't have the right to re-release it or put it into syndication unless they wanted to spend the money to clear the rights. And again, they thought it's an old Paramount Marx Brothers movie, 1930. What a creaky thing. We got plenty of the movies we can show. We don't need to spend money on that one. And of course, me being a fanatic, Marx Brothers fanatic, and my friends having similar tastes, we all thought it would have been well worth Universal's while to spend the money to do that. And there was a bootleg copy of it playing at a theater in Orange County in December of '73, when there was the first of several gasoline shortages. But all of my friends and I piled into a car and drove all the way to Orange County to watch this awful, bleary dupe of a dupe of a dupe of the great lost Marx Brothers film. And it was wonderful to finally see it. I mean, Groucho played Captain Spaulding, and his theme song came from it, and I Shot an Elephant in My Pajamas came from it. And in my naivete, I was thinking, I wonder if Groucho Marx knows this is playing in Anaheim. I wish I could tell him. And I knew from going through the Beverly Hills phone book that his number wasn't in there, but Harry Ruby's was. And I thought, maybe if I can contact Harry Ruby, he'll tell Groucho about it. And I called, and a nurse answered and took down my number. And if she hadn't answered and written it down, and I had actually talked to Harry Ruby, none of what happened would have happened. So I'm glad he couldn't get to the phone. I got a call from him, which at the time was the most exciting thing. It's like, oh my God, this guy's one of Groucho's oldest friends, and he co-wrote Duck Soup and Animal Crackers and all this. And he said, well, I'll be sure and tell Grouch. And I thought, oh my God, I called him and he's going to tell. And then on New Year's Day of '74, my phone rang, and it was Erin Fleming. And again, being a Groucho fanatic, I knew that she was this young woman who had come into Groucho's life a couple years earlier and was frequently photographed with him and interviewed with him. And they were both on the cover of an Esquire magazine. And I knew that I was like a step closer to the Golden Fleece. And she said, Harry Ruby told me that you saw Animal Crackers. How did they show? How did they have the right to show it? It was against the law for them to show it. And she gave me the third degree. I was just trying to be helpful. And instead, it was like, you shouldn't have been seeing that. And we've been trying to get this thing going. It was a weird sort of being on the accelerator and the brake at the same time, because it was exciting being that close to the man, and yet I'm instantly put on the defensive. And then she talked about how she and Groucho had wanted to convince Universal. We went to see Sid Sheinberg, and he just refused. And And I said, by the way, while you're on the phone, there's something I've been wondering. Some of the books I have say Groucho was born in 1895, and some say 1890. Which is it? And she said, Groucho, when were you born? And I hear October 2nd, 1890. And she said, did you hear? And I said, yes, I heard. Oh my God, he's right there. So they were going to see Woody Allen's Sleeper, so she couldn't talk more, but we sort of connected and made a tentative plan. She was thinking of dragging me to Universal as Exhibit A of this kid that would drive all the way to Orange County during the gas shortage to view Animal Crackers. Therefore, MCA should re-release it. And this turned into a petition drive, and I formed the committee for the re-release of Animal Crackers at UCLA, where I was a history student. And we had a table on Bruin Walk, which was where all the activists were. So there were tables for like gay rights and ending the Vietnam War and legalizing marijuana. And then there we were with clipboards trying to get an old Marx Brothers movie off. Groucho, Aaron arranged for Groucho to come to UCLA. And I said, Groucho, I am very happy to be meeting you after all this time. And he said, well, you should be. And Aaron said, this is Steve Stoliar. He's the one trying to get Animal Crackers released. And Groucho said, well, did you get it? And I said, not yet, but we're all working on it. And he said, well, you better or I'll fire you.
Well, you do a good Groucho, Steve.
A good Groucho. He is a spot-on Groucho.
That's great, yeah.
He said, you better or I'll fire you. And I said, I didn't realize I was working for you. How much are you paying me? And he said, a little less than nothing. And I thought, I can't believe we're repartee with this guy who all I ever wanted to do was shake his hand and thank him for all the laughs. And I used to, I've described the job that I eventually got as a dream come true. And it was literally, in the literal sense of literally, a dream come true, because I used to have vivid dreams of meeting him. And as they would start to dissolve and I would wake up, I would think, no, not again. It was so tangible. I was sure I was meeting him. So to actually meet him, and there we were, surrounded by hundreds of kids in T-shirts and jeans and tennis shoes, and the press, both written and for television. And we're sitting side by side talking about our campaign, and Groucho was fending questions. And I had seen him a couple years earlier doing his one-man show at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, and I was shocked at how old and frail he'd gotten. And I was resentful of the press for having perpetuated the idea that good old Groucho at 82, just as sharp as ever. And then this old man shuffled out and was reading off 3x5 cards. And I thought, oh, he's not there anymore. But what I realized, people said, were you disillusioned when you met him? I said, no, I was re-illusioned, because I had written him off after the one-man show. But getting to talk to him one-on-one, and then later at his house, I realized how much was still there. One of the reporters said, Mr. Marx, what is the purpose of your appearance here today? And he said, I expect to get lunch. And she said, no, but I mean, besides that, well, I may get dinner. And then someone else said, what do you think of all of the attention that the younger generation is paying to the Marx Brothers? And Groucho said, well, I'm flattered. Last Halloween, 3 kids came to my door dressed as Groucho, Hoppo, and Chico. And I said, what did you give them? And he said, I sent for the police. And sure enough, Universal relented, and they struck prints. They cleared the rights, and they decided they would show it in 2 theaters, one in Westwood and one in New York. And then they really didn't want to be bothered with this anymore, because we had basically held them up to public ridicule. But here's this poor old man that wants to see him and his brothers again. And it ended up breaking the house record at the UA Westwood that had been set by the French Connection several years earlier. So it was very gratifying.
I trust that TCM has a nice digitized print of it, don't they?
They do, yes. I mean, we take for granted now that things are all cleaned up and restored. But I'll tell you what bothers me about the restoration. Animal Crackers was filmed at Paramount's Astoria studio in New York. And they didn't have boom microphones then. They had stationary mics. So you had to be near the microphone to pick up your voice. And I used to love showing it to people because when Zeppo appears, he runs down the steps and starts his patter song of saying, I represent the captain who insists on my informing you of these conditions under which he comes here. The women must be. And I would say that's because of the microphone. But now that it has been, quote, digitally restored, some 22-year-old guy at a computer monitor decided, oh, well, there's a dropout of the audio there. I can fix that. I can chunk it. And now the levels are all, and it destroys the charm of the, the stationary mic. But it's wonderful that, it's so easy to see these films now. Because when I was a kid, I know you all understand that, but anyone under 60 or so doesn't understand that growing up in the 60s and the early 70s, if you wanted to see an old movie, you got TV Guide and you read through it. And if Lives of a Bengal Lancer with Gary Cooper was on at 2:18 a.m. on Channel 5, you circled that and you willed yourself to stay awake past Carson and past the Tomorrow Show into the netherworld of Cal Worthington car commercials, and then you saw the movie. But now, I mean, between first there was American Movie Classics, and now TCM, and of course video and digital and streaming, and now you mention a movie to someone and they pull something out of their pocket and punch a few buttons and they're watching it. And what we would have given if it had been that easy to cross movies off the list that you always wanted to see, but it had the cycle.
Steve, the name Erin Fleming comes up a lot. Obviously, she became his close companion. What was her background before she was introduced to Groucho? Was she an actress?
She was a Canadian actress, primarily on the stage. She had done a little bit of film work and television work, but was mostly trying to establish herself. And she was in the office of a writer-producer named Jerry Davis, who I later got to know and who was just a great, colorful fellow. He was essentially the model for Jack Lemmon's character in Tribute. And he was just a really colorful fellow. And Aaron was in his office because he was producing The Odd Couple for TV. And Groucho happened to call Jerry Davis. And Jerry said, I can't really talk right now. I have this actress, Erin Fleming. And Groucho said, Fleming was the last name of all the girls that Harpo ever dated. And Groucho was looking for a secretary. And so Jerry put them in touch. And Aaron at the time thought, well, this isn't really the gig that I was hoping for, but maybe I can hitch my wagon to his star. And cutting to the end, here is a postscript that Jerry Davis told a friend of mine. Introducing Aaron to Groucho was one of the biggest regrets of my life.
Mm-hmm.
So there was, shall we say, a dark side to their relationship that split his friends and family neatly down the middle. And I was caught in the midst of, because I was hired. Aaron was the one that hired me. I will always be grateful to her for that, because I had several summer jobs fall through in 74 and thought I got nothing to lose. So I called and said, is there anything at all you think she said, well, we need someone to handle his fan mail and organize all of his memorabilia. And I thought, oh, please, please, please. And she hired me, and I got to work in his house the last 3 years of his life, being treated as, not as the help, but as a member of the household. And I'll never begrudge her that. But I also got to see how abusive she could be, how mercurial, door slamming, screaming. She was later diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, and also took recreational drugs in addition to prescription medication. And she didn't run cool and warm. She ran white hot and freezing. And you could never quite tell. There'd be something you'd think was innocuous, and she'd just throw a shit fit and be just like Cruella de Vil.
What was that like for Groucho, Steve?
One of the themes of the book I wrote about all of this, Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House, is that, as Andre Gide said, the color of truth is gray. And as I've gotten older and grayer, I found that to be repeatedly true, because people are rarely all villainous or all heroic. And Groucho was sort of infatuated with her. He was flattered that she was so devoted to him. I never talked to anyone that really felt there was any kind of physical romantic relationship, but he loved that she doted on him. And, it's a common, unfortunately, all too common scenario where a formerly strong man gets enamored of an ambitious younger woman who alienates the friends and family. So she would scream at him and call him a stupid, senile son of a bitch, which just was like sticking a needle through my heart. And his blood pressure would get dangerously high. Sometimes he would cry and want to know what he could do to get back in her good graces. But, those of us in the household thought it could be like a drug addict where trying to remove Aaron from Groucho could be more deleterious than letting her continue the way she was. And if you had asked Groucho, he would have said, I want Aaron here. I enjoy having her around. So it was a very delicate, it's very difficult for me. I was, 20 and had grown up in a household where nobody raised their voice or used four-letter words, or there was no drinking or drug abuse or anything like that. And I'm just sort of dropped into this petri dish and asked to thrive or perish. And so the other people at the house, the maid, the cook, and other people, we would all meet and kind of talk about what's been going on. And we actually did try to overthrow her and substitute a younger, attractive one of his nurses, because we thought he'd still have the arm candy, but he'd have someone that had his physical, considerations at the forefront.
Steve, excuse me, I got friendly. I was very friendly with Milton Berle later in his life. And I kind of know what you're talking about. I'll leave it at that. I will leave it at that.
Yeah, as I say, it happened with John Barrymore. It happened with Bela Lugosi. It happened with...
It may have even happened to Frank Sinatra. At least the girls think so, the daughters.
And then there was also Casey Kasem.
Casey Kasem. It's about a little dog named Snuggles.
Was she ever, Steve, was she ever accused of any fiscal improprieties in terms of his money?
Fiscal. I thought you said physical.
Well, let's get into both physical and fiscal.
Fiscal. Well, physical. I never saw her hit him, but she would threaten him. You better get going or I'll slap you all the way to Pittsburgh, she said once. I saw her throw a wadded up cloth napkin at him. But the thing is, if you know anything about psychology, emotional and mental abuse can be just as bad, if not worse, than physical. We grew up with the sticks and stones may break your bones, but names will never harm you.
Not true.
They will. They will harm you deeply. They will send you into years of therapy to get away from those names that harmed you. So, as I say, she would cause his blood pressure to go up. And, he had a cook, Martha, who was really wonderful. She was with him since You Bet Your Life, which I thought was just, wow, what an amazing thing she was able to witness all these years with him. And she said, basically, Mr. Marx is very lucky to have someone like that in his life, and very unlucky that it's Miss Fleming. And I thought that was just such a wise assessment. And it's
Steve,
true.
do the Marx Brothers own their own movies?
No. Paramount were the first 5 films were Paramount, which was sold to Universal, and then the next batch were MGM, which retained the rights. Groucho had a half interest in You Bet Your Life, so he made money. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Come back. Yes, he owned all the... well, we've lost him.
I owned A Night in Casablanca for many years. I brought the negative.
Yes.
So that was the last Marx Brothers movie that they made together without cameos, as you know.
Yeah. And that would have been a decent swan song if they hadn't made Love Happy.
Yeah.
Steve, the comedians in the latter part of Groucho's life, did Groucho ever talk about certain comedians that he enjoyed? For instance, was he a Woody Allen
loved
fan?
Woody Allen. He loved Woody Allen. He loved Dick Cavett. And he had a sort of avuncular interest in both of their careers and would advise them give them feedback on appearances that he saw and encouragement. He never got to see Saturday Night Live because it was on past his bedtime. So I don't know how he would have responded to that. He liked All in the Family. He didn't like the Mary Tyler Moore Show and basically said she wasn't my cup of tea, is the way he phrased that. But he always remained interested in what was happening in comedy. And basically, he turned his peers on to Woody Allen, because when they would start with, nobody's funny anymore, it isn't like when we were making... And Groucho would say, well, there's this young fellow from New York who's doing some fine work, and you really should check him out. And so he was able to win them over because of his stamp of approval.
To your knowledge, did they ever meet?
Who?
Woody and Groucho.
Yes, I've never seen a photo of the two of them together, but when Groucho would go to New York, they would connect. And Woody basically said, he said it was basically like having lunch with a funny uncle. He wasn't starstruck. Dick Cavett he never stopped being starstruck. Cavett never stopped being that kid from Nebraska who's thinking, I can't believe they're paying me money to talk to Fred Astaire. But Woody didn't get fazed by that, but it was like, if the quality of the conversation is worthwhile, then that's fine, but not because it's a famous person. So he just said it sort of like having a funny uncle. And but they weren't often on the same coast, unfortunately.
I'm interested in talking about You Bet Your Life, if we can, Steve. A lot of people seem to be shocked when they found out that there were writers on You Bet Your Life. They somehow thought that Groucho just knocked off these bon mots anytime. Can we talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, yeah, and it was also a shock to the writers. After the show folded, they would try to get another gig, and they would say, well, what did you do most recently? I was a writer on You Bet Your Life. Well, what do you mean you were a writer? You wrote down, which mountain gets the most rainfall in Peru? No, I mean, and they had trouble getting gigs because people didn't. This is another case where the color of truth is gray, because first of all, there's the whole concept of comedians have writers, and you get people that are disappointed. It's like, you mean Johnny Carson didn't come out each night and just start talking about things that occurred to him in politics that day? Or Bob Hope didn't just come out and start talking for 20 minutes. So the idea that because they had writers, they were lesser wits, there's a big flaw there.
It was said that Bob Hope had the cue cards on his honeymoon night.
Well, you see, that's unfair too. And all right, so I'm dropping Cavett's name again. He and I became good friends through Groucho, and he wrote the introduction to my book, and we've remained good friends. But he was telling me about when Cavett was on the writing staff of the Merv Griffin show. Again, wondering, what does a writer do on the Merv Griffin? He said there was one night when Maurice Chevalier and Bob Hope were the guests. So Cavett, again, being that kid from Nebraska, thought, I'm going to hang around the green room because I want to know what Maurice Chevalier and Bob Hope talk about. So he went in, and Hope said, hey, Maurice, you look terrific, man. What's your secret? And Chevalier said, "Well, I'll tell you, Bob, I don't drink and I don't fook." And Hope said, "Really? Do you sook?" And to me, that was proof that he was in fact witty on his own without any preparation. And of course, if you listen to his radio show or see the Paramount films, you realize that he was more than just that guy that we saw on the NBC specials talking about the NFL and Brooke Shields and dressing up silly. And, he really was a top flight comedian. You Bet Your Life had writers, and the staff would interview the contestants before the show and would write down suggested things for Groucho to say. And they would say, "Oh, if he asks you if you have any hobbies, give that answer the same way you gave it." But there's no way that they could have enlisted these contestants to, quote, deliver specific lines off of what Groucho said, because they really weren't professionals. So Groucho often, what they did was they had an overhead projector that would write down the suggested lines for Groucho, and he had the option of using them or not. And you could sort of tell it's a little bit more forced when it's one of the pre-written lines. But much of it was also stuff that occurred to him, because I knew from having lunch with him, even in his 80s and in a diminished capacity, that a conversation with him was still peppered with making fun of words and teasing back and forth and all that. And the director of the show, Bob Dwan, told me that they would film about 45 minutes to an hour and then edit it down to a half hour with commercials. And once they edited it down, he said there was a very large percentage that ended up being Groucho's ad-libs. But he had to have, the freedom to not be on the spot, to be constantly funny for a half hour, regardless of what the contestants said. And as we've seen from other comedians over the years, Cosby and Hackett and Leno, it's harder than it looks to just converse with people and then play the game. So the idea that, quote, Groucho had writers doesn't mean that anyone sitting in that chair could have done what he did, but it's disingenuous to say that he made up all that stuff as he went along. So
Steve,
it's some in between. Yes, sir.
Steve, a couple of years ago when we did our interview, the filmed adaptation of your book, Raising Eyebrows, was majorly on the burner. Jeffrey Rush was cast as Groucho, and yet I've not heard anything lately. Is the project still on the burner?
It's still on the burner. The challenge is getting an independent film financed after the big COVID shutdown and after the strikes, and now with, shall we say, a volatile financial situation nationally and internationally. So everyone who was connected with it is still connected with it. We have Oren Moverman co-wrote the script with me and is the director. And Jeffrey Rush, Jeffrey said that the upside of all the delays is that he'll require less makeup to be the old Groucho when we finally get around to it. And Sienna Miller wants to play Aaron Fleming, which is fine. And the whole thing it's been broken down into it's been budgeted into shooting days and pages of the script and all this. And it's ready to go, except for, that slight technicality of money to make it happen. So no one has lost interest, and no one has said, well, we gave it our best shot.
And how big a budget are we talking about?
It's about $6 million, which, you can't compare that to,
that's
something from the
Coffee
Marvel
on an
universe.
Avengers movie.
Yes, well, especially with Coffee rising weekly due to
And
the mango.
Who has someone been cast to play you?
There was someone that Oren had in mind that he had worked with before. But because this is dragged on, he has aged out of being able to play the young me. So they're currently, actually, even as we speak, he and the woman who owns the production company, Miranda Bailey, are conferring on other young actors who have the chops to play Steve, because Steve is a main character. It's basically a play with three people. It's elderly Groucho and ambitious Aaron and naive Steve dropped into this, like I said, this petri dish.
Steve, have you ever considered it being a play first?
Oh, here's a name drop for you. S.J. Perelman made the same recommendation to me.
Well,
not about the book, because the book didn't exist yet, but he appeared at Groucho's once on the way back from one of his famous around the world jaunts, and I was fortunate to be able to stay there during his visit. After dinner, he took out a cigarette and said, "Groucho, do you mind if I smoke?" And Groucho said, "I don't care if you're burning." And Perelman said, "That was good. Now let's try it for time." And I thought, gee, it's like being on the set of Monkey Business in 1931. And I went back to my office in the house, and Perelman had to take a leak. And on his way back from the bathroom, I collared him and showed him an early draft of Horse Feathers. And I asked if he'd seen it lately, and he hadn't. And we got to talking, and I told him about how I loved the Algonquin Round Table, especially Robert Benchley, and he was a friend of Benchley's. And I thought, I'm engaging him. He's this curmudgeon that, and I'm in tennis shoes and T-shirt and jeans, because Aaron said, "Oh, Sid won't mind how you're dressed." And he comes in a three-piece suit with a woman with a full-length mink and diamonds. And Andrew Duggan in a three-piece suit and his wife. And I'm saying, you can't believe how excited I am to meet you. And he asked me about my interests, and I said I'd like to write for television, because to me that seemed the shortest route to actually getting some money, as opposed to writing a spec movie or something. And he recommended writing a play, because in the theater it's the writer that has more control than either of those other, which is true. In movies, it's the director, and in television, it's the producer. But I've never had much faith in the time and effort that would go into writing a play and trying to get that on its feet. But it occurred to me that the film was very play-like early on. It's almost all takes place inside Groucho's house, mixing and matching the people who came and went and the household staff. But it's essentially those three characters. But I really wouldn't know. I don't know that spending the time on adapting it into play and then trying to find some place to put it on or have a reading or something would be any quicker route than the wiser, more experienced minds than mine who are currently working on trying to find people to back it financially.
I think a great young Steve Stoliar would have been the fellow who played in My Favorite Year.
Mark Lynn Baker?
Yes,
yeah.
Mark Lynn Baker would have been great. Yeah. I think that was.
He would have been fun. The thing is, people suggest young people, and I'm always saying, you don't understand. He's 43 now. You don't understand.
No, I understand that, of course.
Yeah, because I was, they have to be able to play collegiate, 19 or 20, and the people. I was thinking a young Matthew Broderick, the guy who was in Licorice Pizza, who was the son of Philip Seymour Hoffman, seems like a viable choice. But again, I've got the director and the producer working on potential, and unfortunately, bankable gets into it. You get into people want to know, well, who's in it and what, and then they feed that into a machine that tells them how much money their last film made if you amortize it over
I've got an idea for you, Steve, because she's now free of her work on the James Bond movies. Barbara Broccoli, who's probably sitting on a coin, did the Gloria Graham movie, and I know that did very well. But I think she's a respectful person of film history. I think somebody should approach her and see if she would at least take a look at the script, because I think she likes film history. She comes from film history, and it might be worth it.
I will pass that on. I look for any and all possibilities for someone, because I do of course run into people who say, well, Groucho's not really that hot right now, and then I think about like Gods and Monsters, and I think about pitching that, and going in and saying, well, so what's it about? It's about James Whale. Who? James Whale. He directed Frankenstein. Oh, so it takes place in the 30s? No, in the 50s. Oh, so what happened then? Was there like a murder or something? No, he was retired, and he has an interest in the pool boy. Okay, here's several $1 million. Go make that movie. So, or Ed Wood, Ed Wood was hardly, he was a laughed at commodity because his films were so bad, but they were so bad they were good. And Ed Wood ended up being a wonderful film, and Martin Landau got supporting actors. So
Johnny Depp.
Yeah, he was good.
I would say that the idea that the movie about James Whale would have been made, I would have bet millions that it could never have happened. Never.
Who cares? And yet it was a fine thing.
It was
so in this case,
film.
Yeah. There's some of Sunset Boulevard in my story. Except that the crazy aging person is split between Aaron and Groucho. He was the fading icon, but she was the mercurial character. My favorite year, there was that Orson and Me movie, or my week with Marilyn.
Well, the fact that your budget is so low, the fact of the movies, the studios make movies now that, well, the latest I heard was this Electric something on Netflix. It only cost $320 million. And so...
carefully, Steve, when they make those movies, they cover their bets with outside financing in most cases.
Well, I think Netflix can just finance those movies out of their monthly receipts. But it's the thing is, it is true though that even on a low budget, like right now, even me going out and trying to raise money for comedies, try to raise $2 million, try to raise $1 million in this financial climate is challenging. But you've got a great brand there, especially for older listeners and older viewers. And I think that you're going to find that money, Steve, because this is a story that needs to be told.
Steve, I want to mention something to you, please. And that is that my wife and I got hooked a couple of years ago on old reruns of Murder, She Wrote. And I noticed you wrote some of those. That thing was addictive.
I did. I got to write a Murder, She Wrote. It ended up being the last TV appearance of Robert Sterling and Ann Jeffries, whom I loved as a kid watching Topper. And one of the writers for Topper was Stephen Sondheim, and I don't know what happened to him after the show. That was very cool to be able to write one of those and to put together the husband and wife team for their last TV appearance.
But talk about a successful series.
Yeah.
My Lord.
I knew Peter Fisher from when I was a production. After Groucho died, I became a production secretary at Universal. Initially in the steno pool, typing scripts from 11 to 8 every day, pushing Kojaks, Berettas, Columbos, Rockford Files through my Selectric 2. And I just loved wandering around the studio. I couldn't understand the other people who worked there that just would punch in and then punch out for their lunch hour and punch out and go home. To me, it's like it's like, wow, this is where this was shot, and who's here today. And I got to meet Lauren Bacall on the set of of Rockford Files and Fred Astaire on the set of Battlestar Galactica, of all the unlikely combinations. And just to go and look at the stage where Chaney Sr. shot Phantom of the Opera, and it still had the balcony seats. I loved that. I used to see Hitchcock being driven in. He had a dark green Lincoln Continental, and he would be in the back of that, unmistakable. I don't remember how I got to talking about, Murder, She Wrote. So I knew Peter from when I was a production secretary, and then Dick Cavett hired me to write for him in New York in '82. And then when I came back to LA, I sort of left LA, a production secretary, and arrived at JFK, this writer from LA that Dick Cavett wanted. And so then with some credits under my belt, when I came back, Peter let me pitch stories for Murder, She Wrote, and one of them caught his ear, and so I'm very proud of that. And also it ended up being the one I wrote for a number of episodic shows, Simon and Simon and the new KRP in Cincinnati and Sliders. It ended up being the one that was least rewritten and least tinkered with. You know, if you've ever dealt with television, you often end up with a script that has your name on the front, but it might as well be the dust jacket to a different book by the time the staff finishes with it. In the case of the Murder, She Wrote, much of what I wrote made it all the way through to the end. So thanks for mentioning
Steve,
that.
we're coming to the end of the show, but before we go, I wanted to ask you about what are you working on these days? I know you're obviously trying to get the movie launched, but are you involved in any other writing projects?
I'm working on with a guy named Tom Hensley, who was Neil Diamond's keyboardist for 40 years, and has remarkable stories about touring behind the scenes, but also as a session keyboardist in the 60s and 70s. And he has great stories about Phil Spector and John Lennon and touring with various personages, and so because I had done something similar with a TV director named Howard Storm. We co-wrote a book called The Imperfect Storm.
Howie Storm.
Yes, Howie. He's 93 and has all of his marbles.
Boy, did he do a lot of stuff. Wow.
He did, yeah, and he was a stand-up in the late 50s and early 60s. He has so many stories about the mobbed up clubs and all this. And, you know, he was this little Jew. He still is, but even when he was younger, he was this little Jew. But he came from a tough side of New York where there were these Jewish gangs. And so many of his stories end up with him saying, if you touch me again, I'm going to knock you down and kick you until you stop moving. And it was sort of like, it's astonishing that he was not stabbed to death at a very early age, because he was just fearless, standing up to all sorts of people. His father was involved with Murder Incorporated, and one of his uncle was rubbed out by the mob. All this, I mean, it was really colorful stuff. So likewise, I mean, Tom Hensley doesn't have those life or death stories, except, of course, when you talk about Phil Spector. But that's what I'm working on. And yes, trying to get the movie off the ground. And
if we want to pay our respects to Groucho, where is he placed in terms of cemeteries? Is he in LA or New York?
He is where my parents are.
Oh.
He was cremated and they weren't, but it's the same. It's Eden Memorial Park in the north. It's like the North San Fernando Valley, like Granada Hills. Right. I know. And there's just a little plaque that says Groucho 1890 to 1977. You know, for all the talk about epitaphs and what does it say and what did he think, and it's just very simple. I think because by the time he died, you know, there were the two warring factions of his son Arthur and his people, and Aaron and her people, and it was just there was no ceremony, there was no it was very little hoopla. He was
But in the history of show business, there probably hasn't been a dozen celebrities, if you will, who came out as this unique something that was bigger than life, and he was one of them.
I'm not going to disagree with you.
Yeah,
Steve,
was,
does it say Julius, or does it say Groucho, or it say both on the
Groucho
plot?
Marx.
Groucho
And
Marx.
people have asked, did they call each other by their real names? And no, they called each other Groucho, Harpo, Chico, Zeppo.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And George Jessel used to make such a big deal out of saying, I never refer to him as Groucho. I always refer to him as Julius because that was his real name. And so Julius here. And I would think, why was it good enough for Harpo to call him Groucho, but you have to boast that you'll call him by his real name? And he signed his checks, Groucho Marx, his driver's license. So I should also, in terms of shameless plugs, mention that Raised Eyebrows can be found in book form and Kindle and audiobook with me doing the voices, big surprise, on Amazon, or if someone would like a signed or personalized copy, they can go to my website, Steve Stoliar, STOLIAR.com, and I will be happy to sign it and send it in your general direction.
and you also do a great Georgie Jessel.
Oh, children stop me on the street. It's between George Jessel and Bennett Cerf. They asked me to do my... Are you currently appearing on Broadway in a musical involving a citrus fruit or small child? I do people that no one else does because there's no competition. Nobody else says, I can do a better Ralph Bellamy than you, so I'll do Ralph.
Oh, Ralph Bellamy. Good one.
Man Against Crime.
I don't think anybody's ever done Ralph Bellamy.
I used to play what you'd call the gooseberry role,
Sure.
which is the fella who'd lose the girl to Cary Grant, for instance. Then I did Roosevelt, and that was quite a picture.
Mm-hmm. Sunrise
Again.
at Campobello.
Very good. I recognize that. It's great, Steve. But not
Hire
Ray
me.
Milland. Can you do Ray Milland? I mean, that's,
Oh, Mark, of course I'd call the police if I thought they'd believe. Why don't you let me play my little game with the circles? Why don't you go home, Mr. Burnham? Go home and write that story with
great.
that nice lady. Oh, Nat, don't you know that one is too many and 100 isn't enough? Ta-da!
Outstanding. Great.
Okay, well, I've left you with Ray Milland.
Yes.
Never before ever did that happen. That's great.
Hey,
Steve, you're on.
what was that flock of balloons that just went by?
I think I need to turn the show over to our producer and our host, Mike Faber.
Thank you,
Okay.
Steve. And thank you, Steve, for joining us tonight. It was a
My
pleasure. You've reached the end of this episode of the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this without you. We want to hear from you, so please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Remember, you could also find us wherever fine podcasts are found. And now you could even find us up on our YouTube channel. If you made it this far into this episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? Or if you're listening, please give us 5 stars.